The acrid scent of cheap incense mingled with the cold sweat of a tense multitude. In the heart of Theron's marketplace, beneath a sky ashen and weeping in grim synchronicity with its people, stood Silas, the monk. His eyes, a startling, glacial blue, gazed into nothingness with an intensity that seemed to pierce the very fabric of time itself. The iron chains on his wrists clinked a mournful rhythm, echoing the frantic drumbeats of the hearts that watched him. There was no fear etched upon his weathered face, only a disquieting, almost mocking serenity. For weeks, whispers had haunted the narrow alleys of Theron. Hushed tales of the reclusive monk who had abandoned his monastery, nestled deep within the howling mountains. They said he spoke truths that even time itself should not know, secrets as ancient as the very earth beneath their feet. But it was the last of these truths that had brought him to this somber scaffold. The king will die in 7 days, he had uttered, his voice strangely calm, amidst the cacophony of the bustling market. It wasn't a shout, nor a grand proclamation, but a mere whisper, almost a lament, that, ironically, had reverberated throughout the entire realm. The air around Silas seemed to hum, not with the magical energies of sorcerers, but with the chilling weight of inevitability. People exchanged terrified glances, remembering his earlier predictions, those that had initially been dismissed as ramblings, only to manifest with unnerving precision. The blacksmith's son's demise, the ruined harvest, the downfall of Baron Lotharol had been whispered by Silas, and all had come to pass, but to foretell the death of a king. That was high treason, witchcraft in its most audacious form, a direct affront to the crown and to the very gods themselves. The royal guards, their polished helmets reflecting the meager light, maintained a respectful, almost fearful distance. No one dared approach too close to the man who seemed to have one foot in the world of the living, and the other already past the veil of the future, a prophet or a madman, his fate hanging precariously in the balance as the crowd held its breath, waiting for a sign, any sign, of divine intervention or royal decree. The news of the monk's audacious pronouncement reached King Theron within the gilded confines of his solar, carried by a breathless, stammering messenger whose eyes still held the wide-eyed shock of the marketplace. Theron, a man in his late middle years whose once sharp features had begun to soften with years of feasting and unchallenged authority, scoffed, dismissing it with a wave of his bejeweled hand. "A madman's ramblings," he declared, his voice booming through the richly tapestried chamber, the sound echoing off the polished marble floors. "Some vagrant seeking notoriety. Have him flogged and thrown into the deepest dungeon. Let him contemplate his treasonous words in darkness." He took another indulgent sip from his goblet of vintage wine, its ruby hue catching the afternoon light, filtering through the stained glass windows depicting heroic tales of his ancestors. The idea that a simple, disheveled monk could predict his demise was ludicrous, an insult to his divine right and the strength of his heavily armored guard. However, the king's initial bravado did little to quell the unease that rippled through the court like a tremor. Whispers, far more hushed than those in the marketplace, began to circulate among the assembled nobles and advisors. They recalled Silas's previous, unnervingly accurate predictions, the blight that had decimated Lord Elmsworth's prized orchards, the unexpected death of the Queen Mother's favorite falcon. Events seemingly insignificant, yet now imbued with a sinister weight. Even the most staunchly rational among them couldn't entirely dismiss the monk's pronouncements. Fear, subtle yet pervasive, began to poison the air of the royal court, a stark contrast to the usual atmosphere of obsequious flattery and scheming ambition. Some advisors cautiously suggested a more thorough investigation, perhaps even questioning the monk further, but the king, fueled by pride and a deep-seated belief in his own invincibility, would hear none of it. "Enough," he roared, slamming his goblet down on the ornate table, the sudden noise silencing the nervous murmurs. "This matter is closed. The monk is a charlatan, a fearmonger. Speak of him again, and you will share his fate." Yet, despite his forceful pronouncements, a flicker of doubt, a tiny seed of apprehension, had been planted in the king's heart, a seed that would slowly, insidiously, begin to sprout in the days to come, casting a long shadow over the gilded cage of his royal existence as the seventh day drew nearer with each passing hour. The king's defiant decree hung heavy in the air, a fragile shield against the creeping dread. Yet, even within the insulated walls of the palace, The monk's words began to burrow into the minds of the courtiers, and even subtly, into the king's own. Theron, usually consumed by hunting and lavish banquets, found his nights plagued by unsettling dreams and his days punctuated by an uncharacteristic irritability. He dismissed his most trusted advisors with snappish retorts, found fault in every dish served, and even the court jester's usually amusing antics failed to elicit a genuine laugh. The once vibrant royal halls, usually bustling with gossip and merriment, grew quieter, a tense silence punctuated by nervous coughs and averted gazes. Outside the palace gates, in the winding streets of Theron, the fear was far more palpable. The common folk, unburdened by royal decorum, openly discussed the prophecy, their voices hushed but their eyes wide with apprehension. Merchants reported dwindling sales as people became more hesitant to spend, saving their meager coins for what felt like an inevitable, uncertain future. Farmers eyed their fields with suspicion, remembering Silas's prediction of the blighted harvest. The city, usually a hub of commerce and life, seemed to hold its breath, a collective pause in anticipation of the seventh day. Rumors, like wildfire, spread through the taverns and marketplaces. Stories of strange omens, a raven with eyes of fire spotted over the palace, a sudden, inexplicable frost that nipped at the budding spring flowers, the unsettling silence of the usually boisterous market square at dawn, all were attributed to the monk's curse. Priests, usually quick to condemn such superstitions, found themselves struggling to reassure their congregations, their sermons on faith and divine protection ringing hollow against the growing tide of fear. The king, in his isolated grandeur, remained oblivious to the depth of this public unrest, convinced that his dismissal had quelled the foolishness, but the collective anxiety, a silent, invisible force, was gathering strength, weaving a tapestry of dread that stretched from the meanest hovel to the highest turret of the royal castle. Each sunrise brought them closer to the dreaded seventh day, and with it, the terrifying possibility that the madman monk, imprisoned for his audacious foresight, might be nothing less than a prophet of doom. Chapter 4. The king's growing unease. The days dwindled. The king's carefully constructed facade of indifference began to crack. What started as fleeting irritability escalated into outright paranoia. He began to see conspiracy in every whispered conversation, a hidden meaning in every averted glance. His once hearty appetite vanished, replaced by a nervous gnawing at his fingernails. The opulent meals, once a source of immense pleasure, now felt like a chore, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. Theron would frequently summon his most trusted physician, Master Silas, a woman known for her keen intellect and unwavering loyalty, demanding tonics for his persistent headaches and a pervasive sense of dread he couldn't quite articulate. Elara, however, could find no physical ailment, only the deepening shadows beneath his eyes and the tremble in his hands, clear signs of a mind under siege. The royal guards, initially dismissive of the monk's pronouncements, now found themselves on edge. Their patrols grew longer, their watch more vigilant. Every creak of the ancient palace, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to hold a sinister warning. They spoke in hushed tones of the strange occurrences, sharing tales of unusual dreams and inexplicable chills that ran down their spines. The king himself, despite his outward defiance, began to cling to a small, worn amulet, a relic of protection given to him by his mother years ago, which he now clutched beneath his silken robes, a desperate attempt to ward off the invisible specter of his predicted doom. He even began to consult his court astrologer, a man he usually dismissed as a charlatan, demanding readings of the stars, desperate for any sign that the prophecy could be averted. The astrologer, however, found only troubling alignments, ambiguous portents that offered no comfort, only further fueled the king's mounting anxiety. Even the loyal captain of the guard, Sir Cale, who had personally overseen Silas's imprisonment, found himself watching the monk's cell with a new, unsettling frequency, wondering if the madman's words truly held power. The vibrant life that once hummed within the palace walls was slowly being suffocated by a chilling premonition, a cold dread that mirrored the gloom settling over the city itself. The king, once so assured of his power and immortality, was now a prisoner of his own fear, counting down the hours to the dreaded seventh day. With the dreaded seventh day looming ever closer, King Theron's fear curdled into frantic desperation. He began to grasp at straws, consulting every charlatan and soothsayer his increasingly nervous advisors could find. Gold flowed freely from the royal coffers as merchants peddled dubious amulets, concocted potions, and whispered ancient incantations, each promising to ward off the ominous prediction. None offered any genuine solace. Theron, once a beacon of regal composure, was now a shadow of his former self. His eyes hollow with sleepless nights, and his movements jumpy and erratic. He spent hours pacing the royal gardens, muttering to himself, then would abruptly retreat to his private chambers, demanding silence and solitude, only to call for his most trusted guards moments later. Convinced of an imminent threat lurking in every corner, he ordered drastic security measures. The palace gates were triple barred and guarded by a rotating detachment of his most formidable knights. Every visitor was scrutinized, every package inspected, and the few courtiers still brave enough to approach him were subjected to piercing, suspicious glares. Food tasters, already a fixture of royal life, now worked under the king's direct, watchful eye, their every swallow agonizingly slow. The king even sent secret emissaries to distant lands, seeking ancient texts and forgotten rituals that might offer protection against such a dire prophecy. One such emissary returned with a faded, cryptic scroll from a nomadic tribe. Speaking of warding sigils against the whispered doom, Theron, clutching the brittle parchment, ordered his court mages to decipher its contents immediately, a desperate hope flickering in his tormented mind. He even considered a public display of power, a grand parade through the city, to quell the unrest and assert his divine authority. But the thought of facing the fearful, questioning eyes of his subjects made him recoil. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, his every action dictated by the monk's chilling prediction. The once proud monarch was reduced to a paranoid recluse, desperately trying to outrun a fate that seemed to grow more inevitable. With each tick of the grand clock in the palace courtyard, its chimes echoing the relentless march towards the fated day. The dawn of the seventh day broke over Theron, not with the usual golden glow, but with a sky the color of bruised plums, heavy and oppressive. A thick mist, unusual for the season, clung to the city, muffling sounds and lending an eerie, dreamlike quality to everything. Within the palace, the king's chambers were a scene of desperate vigil. Theron, gaunt and trembling, sat on the edge of his massive bed, his royal robes discarded for a simple tunic, revealing the worn amulet clutched so tightly in his hand that his knuckles were white. Master Ilara, the physician, stood by, offering sips of water that the king barely acknowledged. Sir Cale, the captain of the guard, was stationed at the door, his face grim, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his sword. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist into menacing shapes. Every distant sound was amplified into a portent. Outside, the city was unnaturally quiet. The bustling marketplace was almost deserted, its usual vibrant clamor replaced by a chilling silence. Shops remained shuttered, and the streets, typically teeming with life, were eerily empty. Those few brave souls who ventured out moved with a furtive haste, their eyes darting nervously towards the palace, then quickly to the sky, as if expecting it to crack open at any moment. The air itself felt charged, thick with unspoken dread. Even the palace staff, usually accustomed to the king's erratic moods, moved with an almost imperceptible slowness, their faces pale, their movements cautious, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that held the city captive. They knew, as did every man, woman and child in Theron, that this was the day Silas, the imprisoned monk, had foretold. The hours crawled by, each tick of the palace clock a hammer blow against the king's frayed nerves. He looked out of his window, not at his kingdom, but at the heavy mist, imagining it as a shroud descending, slowly, inevitably. The weight of the monk's prophecy was no longer just a psychological burden, it was a tangible presence, pressing down on the entire city, culminating in a suffocating sense of impending doom that permeated every stone of the castle, every breath taken by its terrified inhabitants, and every single second of the longest day in King Theron's life. The hours dragged on, each minute an eternity. Noon passed, then afternoon, and still nothing. The profound silence that had gripped Theron began to shift, not into relief, but into a new, more unsettling form of anxiety. The king, initially rigid with terror, now slumped, exhaustion warring with the lingering fear. He kept glancing at Master Elara, then at Sir Kale, his eyes silently questioning, searching for an explanation for the unsettling calm. Had the monk been wrong? Had his own desperate measures, his amulets and incantations, somehow averted the prophecy? A flicker of hope, fragile and almost unbelievable, began to stir within him, quickly followed by a cold wave of suspicion. Perhaps this was a crueler trick, a prolonged agony. Outside, the city remained shrouded in the peculiar mist. A few curious citizens, emboldened by the lack of any immediate catastrophe, began to emerge from their homes, their steps tentative, their gazes still fixed on the palace. But instead of relief, a strange tension filled the air. The expected disaster hadn't arrived, yet its absence felt more ominous than its presence. Children, usually rambunctious, clung to their parents' legs, sensing the palpable unease. The market stalls remained closed, a silent testament to the fear that still held the city captive. Inside the palace, the king's advisors, who had been hiding in their chambers, slowly began to reappear, their faces betraying a mixture of relief and bewildered confusion. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to interpret the quiet passage of time. Was this the king's defiance, or merely a delayed reckoning? The afternoon wore on, a heavy leaden blanket. The sun, a pale anemic disk behind the mist, began its descent, painting the sky in sickly shades of orange and bruised purple. The stillness of the city was deafening, the silence punctuated only by the occasional distant crow caw or the faint rustle of leaves, each sound seeming to hold a hidden, sinister meaning. Theron's initial terror had been replaced by a gnawing uncertainty, a feeling far more insidious than outright dread. The seventh day was ending, and the prophecy remained unfulfilled, leaving behind a chilling, pervasive quiet that felt like the precursor to something far worse. As the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of deep violet and blood orange, a collective, hesitant sigh of relief rippled through Theron. The seventh day had passed. The king, slumped in his chambers, exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked at Elara, then at Kale, a flicker of bewildered triumph in his eyes. He was wrong, he whispered, his voice hoarse with disuse. The monk was a charlatan after all. A fragile, tentative smile touched his lips, the first genuine expression of relief in days. Sir Kale, ever vigilant, offered a small, deferential nod, while Master Elara, though relieved, still held a lingering thread of concern. The palace, moments before suffocating under the weight of anticipation, now seemed to loosen its grip, as if exhaling with its monarch. But as this fragile sense of reprieve began to settle over the city, a new sound, chilling and utterly unexpected, pierced the night. It wasn't the clang of an alarm bell, nor the roar of a distant battle. Instead, it was a sudden, piercing scream that echoed from the very heart of the royal stables, followed by frantic whinnies and the terrified shouts of stable hands. The sound, raw and filled with sheer terror, cut through the growing sense of calm like a poisoned blade. The king, who had just begun to rise from his bed, froze, his newfound relief evaporating instantly. Sir Kale's hand flew to his sword hilt, his eyes wide with a fresh dread. "What was that?" Theron demanded, his voice thin with renewed fear. The stable master, a burly man named Borin, burst into the king's chambers moments later, his face ashen, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Your Majesty," he gasped, barely able to speak through his terror. It's the royal horse Thunderhoof. He's fallen, a broken leg, and the stable boy who was with him, dead, crushed beneath the hooves." The words hung in the air, cold and stark. Thunderhoof, the magnificent black stallion, the king's pride and joy, the very steed Theron was scheduled to ride in a celebratory procession tomorrow morning to declare his survival and dismiss the prophecy. The procession was meant to be a grand display of his enduring power, a public refutation of Silas's words. The monk had not predicted the king's death on the seventh day. He had predicted the death of a king, and in a horrifying, unforeseen twist, the king of the stables, the majestic beast, vital to the king's planned spectacle, had met its demise, taking a human life with it, just as the prophesied day concluded, leaving a chilling, undeniable confirmation of Silas's chilling foresight. The king stood frozen, the stable master's horrifying words echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the royal chambers. His face, moments ago etched with tentative relief, now twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't his own demise that had been foretold, but the death of a king. Not King Theron himself, but the very symbol of his power. The magnificent thunderhoof, upon which his grand display of defiance rested, and with it, a human life, a stark, undeniable sacrifice. The prophecy had been fulfilled, not in the way anyone had anticipated, but with a chilling, literal precision that spoke volumes of Silas's uncanny foresight. The irony was a bitter pill. The very act intended to mock the monk had become the instrument of his vindication. A cold dread settled over Theron, far deeper than the fear of his own death. This was the fear of the unknown, of a power beyond his comprehension, a power wielded by the very man he had imprisoned. The madman's ramblings were now irrefutable truths, whispered not by superstitious peasants, but confirmed by a horrific event within his own fortified palace. He looked at Sir Cale, whose grim face mirrored the king's dawning horror. Master Alara, ever the pragmatist, was already considering the implications, the sheer weight of what this meant for the monk. Outside, the night deepened, but the city was no longer quiet. A new hum, low and guttural, began to rise from the streets, not the terrified silence of earlier, but a murmur of awe and fearful reverence. The people, having awaited the king's death, now understood the prophecy in its true, terrifying form. Silas was not merely a fortune-teller, he was a conduit of truths that transcended the mundane, a living testament to a hidden order that even kings could not defy. The royal guard, who had been ordered to maintain the monk's incarceration, now found themselves guarding a prisoner whose power was suddenly undeniable. His words now etched into the very fabric of Theron's history. The king, stripped bare of his defiance, felt the immense, suffocating weight of this new reality. He was no longer just a monarch, but a man humbled by a truth he could not escape, a truth delivered by the very person he had sought to silence. The monk, imprisoned and accused, had proven his wisdom, and the king was now left to grapple with the chilling implications of having silenced a voice that truly knew too much.